A billionaire's hand closes around a black doctor's lab coat in Seoul's most prestigious trauma ward. And the man pointing at the door has no idea he just signed his own ruin in front of 100 witnesses. One shove. One scattered clipboard. One decision that will cost Sebastian Royce everything he has spent his life building in exactly 72 hours. Dr. Kendra Blake hits the floor before the shock does. Her papers are still in the air when she registers it, the cold linoleum under her palms, the stethoscope swung sideways around her neck, the fluorescent hum of the ward filling the silence where her professional dignity used to be. She looks up. Sebastian Royce stands over her, one hand still pointing at the exit, jaw tight, like a man who has never once been told no. Like throwing a woman to the ground in the middle of a hospital is a language everyone here should already understand. They do. That's the problem. The nurses don't move. The residents look away. A senior attendant finds something urgent to study on his tablet. Nobody speaks, because Royce has already spoken. His kind always does. And in this city, money is the loudest voice in any room. Nobody except one. At the far end of the corridor, beyond the glass partition, a phone screen lights up. No message. No voice note. Just 2 words from a name nobody in this building would recognize. Choi Hyunwood reads them once. He doesn't reply. He sets the phone face down on his knee and stares at the middle distance for exactly 3 seconds. Then he dials. By the time Kendra pushes herself to her feet, slowly, deliberately, with the quiet dignity of a woman who will not give him the satisfaction of rushing, Hyunwood is already talking. His voice never rises. It never needs to. On the other end of the line, an empire that took 30 years to build begins to develop its first crack. Royce thinks he threw a doctor out of his way. He doesn't yet know that the woman on the floor is the only reason he gets to walk out of his building tonight. And in that stillness, before a single consequence is landed, before Royce understands what he has set in motion, pause here. Drop 1 word in the comments. 1 word for what you would want that phone call to do to a man like Sebastian Royce. We're reading every single one. And then stay with us, because what happens next is not loud. It is not rushed. It is something far more satisfying than that. 3 hours and 47 minutes earlier, the girl was going to die. That was the clinical fact of it, not a prognosis, not a projection, but the flat, unargued truth that Kendra had read in the scan the moment it came through. 17 years old. Multiple blunt force injuries from a multi-car collision on the Gangnam overpass. Grade 4 splenic laceration, a perforated bowel, and a bleed in the abdominal cavity that was moving faster than the radiology notes had accounted for. The attendant on call had already flagged it as critical but stable. He was wrong on the second word, and Kendra knew it before she'd finished pulling on her gloves. "Get me a second unit on standby," she said. Not loudly. She never said anything loudly in a trauma bay. The scrub nurse, Minji, for years on this floor, good hands, moved without asking why. That was the thing about competence. It didn't need an explanation. It generated its own authority. The OR was cold the way all ORs are cold, that particular refrigerated stillness designed to slow everything down except the people inside it. Kendra worked in it the way she always worked, without theater, without commentary, with a kind of concentration that looked, from the outside, almost like indifference. It wasn't. It was the opposite of indifference. It was every single nerve in her body narrowed to a single point of focus, the rest of the world falling away until there was nothing left but the task, the tools, and the patient on the table in front of her. The bleed was worse than the scan had suggested. Of course it was. "Pressure's dropping," the anesthesiologist said. "I see it." She didn't look up. There is a moment in every difficult surgery. Not every doctor will admit this, but Kendra has always been more honest than comfortable, where the margin closes, where the space between the patient living and not living becomes something you can almost feel against your fingers, thin and trembling, and entirely dependent on what you do in the next 30 seconds. Most surgeons talk about those moments afterward, in the lounge, over bad coffee, with the particular bravado of people who survived something. Kendra didn't talk about them at all. She repaired the bowel in 17 minutes. The bleed was controlled 4 minutes after that. By the time she stepped back from the table and stripped her outer gloves, the girl's pressure was climbing, slow and steady, back towards something that looked like a future. "Good," Kendra said. To no one in particular. To the room. Minji exhaled. The soft, involuntary kind that people don't realize they've been holding. Someone near the door said something in Korean that Kendra didn't catch, but the tone was clear enough. Relief has the same sound in every language. She had walked out of that, or with a stethoscope still warm against her neck, and a coat that smelled like antiseptic and effort, already thinking about the post-op notes, already thinking about the next 6 hours of monitoring, already thinking about the girl's recovery. Not about credit. Not about acknowledgement. Not about the man who had been pacing the family waiting room since the ambulance arrived, with his gold watch and his sharp suit and his particular understanding of the world. That money was the thing that decided who mattered. She would meet him in 40 minutes.
She didn't know that yet.
He had arrived at the hospital the way he arrived everywhere, quietly, without announcement, in a car that drew no attention because that was the point of it. Choi Hyunwood did not do waiting rooms. His assistant had arranged a position near the corridor's glass partition, a standing space with sight lines to the ward entrance and the elevator bank, close enough to see everything and far enough from the foot traffic that no one thought to look at him twice. He had a cup of coffee. He had not touched it in 40 minutes. He was watching the ward doors the way a man watches something he already understands, patient in the way that only people who have never needed to rush can be patient. He had been on the phone with Kendra before the girl was even rushed in, and he knew the surgery had gone well before anyone told him. He could read it in the rhythm of the corridor, the particular way the tension had shifted from sharp to slow, nurses moving with slightly looser shoulders, the anesthesiologist reappearing at the scrub sink without the clipped efficiency of someone mid-emergency. He had learned over many years to read rooms the way other people read text, fluently, without effort, taking in information that most people didn't know they were broadcasting. He was still reading the room when Sebastian Royce came through the ward doors. Hyunwood watched him the way you watch weather, not with alarm, but with the calm, assessing interest of someone calculating what it will cost. He watched the way Royce moved, the particular angle of entitlement in his shoulders, the gold watch catching the fluorescent light as he gestured at the charge nurse. He watched the nurse's posture change, that subtle, horrible collapse of someone deciding it isn't worth the fight. He watched Royce's voice get louder without Hyunwood being able to hear the words, the way a fire gets larger before anyone has called it dangerous. Then Kendra came through the side corridor. He had seen her this way before, coat slightly wrinkled, stethoscope still on, the particular tiredness of someone who had just spent several hours being precisely excellent. There was something he had always admired about the way she carried herself after a difficult surgery, No performance of exhaustion, no visible need for recognition. Just a woman moving toward the next thing that needed doing. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Royce turned the moment he saw her, and even from across the corridor Hyunwood could read the geometry of it. The way a man pivots toward a target he has already selected before he is fully conscious of selecting it. Royce had spent 2 hours in the family waiting room building a version of events that had nothing to do with the facts of them. His daughter had been brought through a public emergency bay instead of the private trauma suite his wealth entitled her to. The ward had been loud and chaotic, full of the ordinary, unglamorous urgency of a public hospital doing what public hospitals do. In Royce's accounting, the delay, 12 minutes between arrival and surgical prep, 12 minutes that Kendra had spent assessing the severity of the bleed with the speed and accuracy that had ultimately saved the girl's life, had been negligence, incompetence, an insult to the standard of care that his money was supposed to purchase. He had decided this in the waiting room, alone with his fear and his pride, and the decision had calcified into something he now wore like a conviction. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted someone to pay for the 12 minutes and the public bay and the indignity of sitting in a plastic chair while a doctor he'd never approved of had his daughter's life in her hands. Kendra was the closest available target. That was the full extent of the logic. Hyunwood watched Royce's mouth moving, watched the charge nurse take a step backward, watched the particular moment a public space becomes an audience. He was already still when it happened.
The grab.
The pull. The sound of papers hitting the floor. Later, people who had been in that corridor would describe what followed as silence. What it actually was, Hyunwood could have told them if he were the kind of man who explained himself, was the specific quiet that arrives when something has already been decided. He set the coffee cup down on the partition ledge. Unhurried. He reached into his jacket pocket, retrieved his phone, and raised it to his ear. On the third ring, his head of operations picked up. Hyunwood said nothing for a moment. Across the corridor, Royce was still pointing at the door, still performing for a crowd too frightened to leave. Kendra was on the floor. The red exit arrow threw its color across the linoleum like something spilled. Sebastian Royce. His voice was quiet, conversational almost. The tone of a man ordering something he has ordered many times before. Delete him. He ended the call before the response came. He already knew the answer. The summons came at 7 the following morning. A single email, institutional letterhead, the kind of language that had been carefully drained of all humanity before it was sent, requested to appear, pending review, in the interest of the hospital's continued operational integrity. Kendra read it twice, standing in her kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and then set her phone face down on the counter and made coffee she didn't drink. The boardroom was on the 14th floor, which she had always thought was too far from the wards, too far from the smell of antiseptic and effort, too far from the sounds that reminded you what the building was actually for. Up here there was carpet and catered water in glass pitchers, and 7 men and women arranged around an oval table with the careful, rehearsed expressions of people who had already made their decision before she walked in. She had known before she sat down. She had known, probably, since the papers hit the floor. Chairman Park spoke first, which was a courtesy. He was the one, at least, who couldn't fully meet her eyes. He used words like complaint and escalation and due process, stringing them together in the particular way that institutions string difficult words together when they want to make a cowardly thing sound procedural. Sebastian Royce had filed a formal negligence claim. The timeline of care had been called into question. The board had a responsibility to its stakeholders. Kendra kept her hands flat on the table. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry, though there was something pressing against the back of her throat that required a specific, sustained effort to hold in place. She laid out the clinical facts the way she always laid out clinical facts, clearly, sequentially, without decoration. The scan, the assessment, the grade of the laceration, the 17 minutes, the girl's pressure climbing back towards something livable. No one wrote anything down. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly too long, and then Chairman Park said that the suspension would be effective immediately, pending the outcome of the review, and that she would of course retain access to legal counsel, and that the board had every confidence this would be resolved in a manner satisfactory to all parties. All parties. She picked up her badge from the table. They had asked her to surrender it, then apparently thought better of asking directly, so it sat there between them like an accusation neither side wanted to name, and she clipped it to her coat pocket. She stood. She thanked them for their time because she had been raised to be precise even when precision cost her something, and she walked to the door. The elevator ride down was 14 floors of stillness. She watched the numbers descend and thought about the girl in the recovery ward right now, waking up slowly under the supervision of a team that Kendra had trained, breathing with lungs that Kendra had fought for, alive in the complete and total way that Kendra had made possible. The lobby doors opened onto gray Seoul morning light. She walked through them with her shoulders straight, her coat neat, her face arranged into the careful neutrality of a woman who understood, with absolute clarity, that breaking down in public was a luxury she had never once been able to afford. The heart breaks quietly sometimes, with good posture, in full view of the street. Sebastian Royce discovered the first problem at 10:43 in the morning, which was when his pilot called to inform him that the Gulfstream had been grounded at Gimpo pending a routine safety audit initiated by the Civil Aviation Authority. Royce told him to sort it out and ended the call. He was on his third espresso of the morning, in the penthouse dining room of his Hanamdong residence, reviewing the negligence filing his legal team had drafted overnight. It was a good filing. Airtight, his lead attorney had said. The kind of document that buries careers quietly and permanently. He told himself the jet was an inconvenience. These things happened. By 11:30, it was no longer the only thing happening. His CFO called from the Singapore office, voice carrying the particular controlled steadiness of a man trying not to communicate alarm while communicating alarm. 3 of Royce's primary operating accounts had been flagged by the Financial Intelligence Unit for a review of inbound transactions dating back 18 months. The accounts weren't frozen. That distinction was made carefully, twice, but access was restricted pending document submission, and the submission window was 48 hours, and the list of documents requested was long enough that 48 hours was, functionally, a joke. Royce set down his espresso cup. He called his attorney. His attorney was in a meeting. He called his second attorney, the one he kept specifically for situations that require discretion, and that call went to voicemail in a way that felt different from ordinary voicemail, though he couldn't have explained why. He sat for a moment in the large, light-filled dining room with its view across the Han River, and he told himself that these were separate incidents. Regulatory friction. The kind of bureaucratic turbulence that money, applied correctly, smoothed out within the week. He had applied money correctly his entire adult life. It had always worked. He did not yet understand that the machinery he was describing as friction was not friction at all. It was architecture, carefully designed, quietly assembled, activated at a specific moment by a specific phone call, the kind of infrastructure that takes years to build and approximately 4 words to deploy. He did not understand that the audit had been requested by a shell entity with no traceable origin, that the FIU flag had been triggered by a suspicious transaction report filed at 11 minutes past 9 that morning, before Kendra had even reached the 14th floor, that the attorneys who weren't answering had each, in the past 2 hours, received a visit or a call from someone they valued more than a retainer. He did not understand any of this because he had spent his life in the part of the world where power announces itself. Suits and watches and square footage, and the volume of a man's voice in a hospital corridor. He had no framework for power that didn't make noise. Outside, the Han River moved the way it always moved, wide and gray and indifferent to the particular smallness of any one man's morning. His phone rang again.
Singapore.
He looked at the screen for a moment before answering. The second domino, it turned out, was already falling before he'd finished processing the first. She was sitting on the kitchen floor when he found her. Not collapsed. That distinction mattered to her, and he understood that it did, which was why he didn't say anything about it. She had simply run out of the particular energy required to maintain verticality, and the kitchen floor was where that had happened, her back against the cabinet beneath the sink, her coat folded neatly across her knees, because even now, even here, she couldn't quite bring herself to drop it on the ground. Her shoes were still on. She was still, in some technical sense, composed. Hyunwood came in through the front door the way he always came in, his own key, no announcement, and found her in the low amber light of the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then he took off his jacket, hung it over the back of a chair, and sat down on the floor beside her. He didn't ask how the meeting went. He already knew. He didn't offer the particular kind of comfort that requires the other person to perform gratitude for it. No arm around the shoulder, no practiced words assembled for the occasion. He simply sat with her, close enough that his arm was against hers, and let the quiet be what it was. After a while, she said, "They didn't write anything down." "I know. I told them exactly what happened. The timeline, the clinical decisions, every single thing I did, and why I did it."
She paused.
They looked at me like I was reading them a menu. He said nothing. She hadn't asked him to respond. "I keep thinking about Park's face," she said. "The way he almost looked sorry. Like being almost sorry was the same as being on the right side of something." She tilted her head back against the cabinet. "It isn't." "No," Hyunwood said. "It isn't." She turned to look at him then. The profile she knew as well as any room in this apartment, the clean, still lines of a face that the rest of the world found unreadable. She had never found it unreadable. She had simply learned, early, that reading it required patience rather than volume. "What did you do?" she asked. "Nothing that can't wait until morning." She held his gaze for a moment, and something passed between them that didn't require translation. The specific understanding of two people who have chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to be honest with each other even when honesty is complicated. "Hyun." Her voice was quiet, not pleading, just precise. He looked at her fully then, which was a thing he did rarely and entirely. The careful, deliberate attention of a man who had trained himself out of most visible feeling and found, with her, that the training only went so far. "He won't touch you again," he said.
Simply.
"The way you state a fact about weather or geography. Something that exists in the world without requiring argument." She exhaled, the soft, involuntary kind. Outside, Seoul moved in its relentless, luminous way, 40 floors below, indifferent and bright. In here there was only the kitchen light and the sound of the city through glass, and two people sitting on the floor together in the particular silence of absolute trust. She didn't ask anything else.
She didn't need to.
The file arrived in 17 inboxes at precisely 6 o'clock the following morning. Not posted. Not leaked to a journalist. Not uploaded to a platform where algorithms and outrage could carry it in unpredictable directions. That was the approach of people who wanted noise. This was something more deliberate, a direct transmission, recipient list curated with the specific care of someone who understood that the most damaging audience for a man like Sebastian Royce was not the public, but the 12 people whose continued confidence was the actual architecture of his wealth. The email had no subject line, no body text, only an attachment, 41 seconds of hospital corridor footage, timestamp visible in the lower left corner, resolution clear enough that every detail read without ambiguity. The white coat, the stethoscope, the papers lifting from the floor like something startled. The red exit arrow, still and accusatory in the background. And in the far corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking, a man in a black suit, raising a phone to his ear with the unhurried calm of someone who has already decided what happens next. By 6:15, 3 of the recipients had forwarded it internally. By 7, it was in the hands of Royce's lead institutional investor, a Seoul-based private equity group that had placed 2 board seats and approximately $400 million into his technology holdings over the preceding 3 years. By 7:30, it had reached the chairman of a Singaporean sovereign fund whose name appeared nowhere in Royce's public filings, but whose quarterly wire transfers constituted, quietly, nearly a fifth of his operating liquidity. Royce himself was asleep when the first call came in. His phone was on the nightstand, volume low, and the name on the screen belonged to a man he had lunched with in Geneva the previous spring. He let it ring. It was not yet 7, and he was not, as a rule, available before 7. By the time he was vertical and caffeinated, there were 11 missed calls. He watched the footage alone, standing in the middle of his home office in a robe that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and what crossed his face in those 41 seconds was not guilt. Guilt requires a particular kind of self-awareness that Royce had long since outsourced, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The dawning, unpleasant understanding that there is a version of yourself that exists on camera, and that version has no access to the explanations, the context, the careful narrative you have constructed around your own behavior. On screen, he was simply a man in an expensive suit throwing a woman to the ground in a hospital corridor. Nothing else read. Nothing else survived the footage. He called his publicist. His publicist had already seen it. He called his lead attorney, the one who had taken his calls yesterday. This time, the call connected, but the conversation that followed was short, and its tone was different from every previous conversation they had conducted in 11 years of professional relationship. Careful, measured, the particular delicacy of a man reassessing the personal cost of proximity. Royce sat down heavily in his desk chair. Outside, the morning was bright and indifferent, the same city it had always been. Only the geometry of it had shifted, the invisible lines of loyalty and leverage that structured his world, quietly, irreversibly, beginning to point in a new direction. By 9 o'clock, Sebastian Royce had decided that the correct response to all of this was aggression. It was, historically, the correct response to most things. He had built his career on the reliable fact that when pressure arrives, the person who applies more pressure back tends to win. He had outmaneuvered a hostile takeover in 2019 by filing for simultaneous injunctions and burying the opposing legal team in discovery requests until they ran out of appetite for the fight. He had silenced 2 investigative journalists, a former business partner, and a regulatory inquiry in the Cayman Islands using variations of the same fundamental principle. Force, applied precisely and without hesitation, in the right places. He called his litigation firm at 9:15 with a specific list of instructions. He wanted the negligence filing accelerated. He wanted defamation proceedings initiated against the hospital's security contractor for the footage breach. He wanted the FIU document submission handled aggressively, not defensively, counterfiling, not compliance. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, the way he always spoke when he was certain of his direction, and when he finished, the senior partner on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment that lasted 3 seconds too long. "There's a conflict issue," the partner said finally. Royce asked him to clarify. The clarification, delivered in the careful, drained language of a lawyer who had already made his calculation, was this: the firm had been retained that morning by an anonymous third-party client on a matter that created an irreconcilable conflict of interest with Royce's current proceedings. They were obligated to withdraw. He was sorry for the timing. He wished him well. The call ended. Royce sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and then called his secondary firm. The boutique criminal defense practice he kept on retainer for situations requiring more discretion than the main firm could provide. That call rang out. He tried the direct line for the founding partner, a man he had shared a table with at a charity gala less than 3 weeks ago, and reached a junior associate who informed him with visible discomfort that the firm was currently unable to take on new matters. He was not a new matter. He had been a client for 6 years. He called 4 more firms over the following hour. 2 had conflicts. 1 was unavailable. 1 returned his call through a paralegal who relayed a message so diplomatically worded it took Royce a full minute to understand that the answer was no. He stood at his window and looked out at the city below, and did what he always did when the shape of a situation refused to become familiar. He ran the logic again from the beginning, looking for the error in his own reasoning. The footage was damaging but manageable. The investor calls could be weathered with the right narrative. The FIU review was bureaucratic procedure. Each individual element, assessed alone, was survivable. But they were not alone. They were sequential, and they were accelerating, and they were connected by something he couldn't see from where he was standing. A logic he couldn't locate the origin of. A sequence initiated by something other than chance. He thought about the hospital corridor. He thought about the man in the corner who hadn't moved. For the first time since the morning, Sebastian Royce felt something that wasn't anger. It arrived quietly, the way real fear always does, not as a shout, but as a question he suddenly didn't want answered. The invitation arrived through his last remaining attorney, a solo practitioner in Mapogu who handled the kind of work that didn't appear in billing records, and it was not phrased as an invitation. It was phrased as a time and an address delivered verbally, with the specific absence of detail that communicates, to anyone paying attention, that the details are not the point. Royce went because the alternative was sitting in his penthouse watching his empire disassemble itself by degrees, and movement, even uncertain movement, felt more like agency than stillness. The address was a private dining room in a building in Yongu that had no signage at street level and no lobby in the conventional sense. Only a corridor, a single elevator, and a man by the door who looked at Royce with the flat, measuring expression of someone assessing a problem rather than greeting a guest. He was shown up without conversation. The elevator opened directly into the room. It was smaller than he had expected and darker. One table.
No windows.
The lighting was the kind that exists for atmosphere rather than function, low and amber, the sort that makes everything look like a decision being made. There was no presentation set up, no second chair position for a negotiation, none of the environmental signals that Royce associated with a business meeting. There was only the table, 2 chairs facing each other across it, and a man already seated in one of them. Choi Hyunwood was holding a coffee cup. He did not stand when Royce entered. He did not gesture toward the empty chair or offer a greeting or arrange his face into any of the expressions that people arrange their faces into when they want something from you. He simply sat with the specific, undisturbed stillness of a man who had been in this position, in every sense, long before Royce walked through the door. Royce sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Royce had used silence as a tool his entire career, had deployed it in boardrooms and courtrooms and across restaurant tables as a form of low-grade aggression, a way of making the other person feel the weight of being assessed. He understood, within the first 10 seconds of sitting across from Hyunwood, that silence operated differently here. It wasn't a tool. It was simply the natural environment of a man who had never needed noise to establish where the power in a room resided. "I don't believe we've met," Royce said.
Because someone had to say something.
Hyunwood looked at him with the calm, direct attention of someone for whom looking is a form of information gathering rather than social performance. He raised the coffee cup slightly, not as a toast, more as an acknowledgement that Royce had spoken. "We haven't," he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft, there is a difference, and Royce felt it immediately, in the way you feel a change in air pressure before you can name the cause. Not soft at all. Just calibrated to exactly the volume the room required, and not 1 degree beyond it. "Then who arranged this?" Royce asked. Hyunwood set the cup down with a small, precise sound. "I did," he said. Then, after a pause so brief it was almost not a pause, "You threw my partner to the floor of her own hospital." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He held Royce's gaze with the patient, settled certainty of someone stating a coordinate on a map, not an argument, not an accusation. Simply a location. The fixed point from which everything else in the room was being measured. "I thought you should know who you did that to." He didn't sleep that night. Not for lack of trying. He lay in the dark of his penthouse bedroom with the city's light bleeding in around the curtain edges and ran the meeting back through his mind the way he always ran difficult meetings, looking for the leverage point he'd missed, the moment where a different word or posture might have shifted the geometry of the room. He found nothing. That was the problem with Hyunwood. There was no seam in it, no gap between the performance and the reality, because it wasn't a performance. The man had simply told him a fact and waited for it to land. He left for the hospital at 7. Not because anyone asked him to. Because his daughter had been moved from the OR recovery suite to the ICU step-down ward the previous afternoon, And because somewhere beneath the investor calls and the attorney problems and the amberlit dining room in Yongu, there was still that, a 17-year-old girl in a hospital bed who was his and who was alive. She was awake when he arrived. That stopped him briefly in the doorway. The particular shock of a face he knew rearranged by exhaustion and medical tubing, but present, conscious, her eyes tracking toward him as he crossed the room. "Dad." Her voice was thin, careful around the discomfort of it. He sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand and said the things fathers say. "You're all right, you're safe, I'm here," and for a few minutes the room was only that. No investors.
No footy.
No quiet man with a coffee cup asking him to consider the coordinates of his own behavior. Then she said, "Where's the doctor?" He looked at her. "The doctors check in on a rotation. They'll come by."
No.
She shifted slightly, winced. "The one from before. The one who talked to me." She paused, gathering the memory from wherever it had been stored beneath the sedation. "Before the surgery." She held my hand. She said, another pause, something moving across her face that wasn't quite pain. She said I was going to be okay, and I believed her. She looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated honesty of someone whose body had recently and completely overridden all social training. "I want to see her." Royce was quiet. She had an accent. His daughter continued, unprompted. "American." She was wearing a white coat. She knew what was wrong before she even looked at the scans. She just knew. The monitors beside the bed registered her pulse, steady and patient. "Is she here?" He thought about the corridor, the papers on the floor, his own hand on the back of a white coat, the specific arrogance of a gesture he had made without a full second's consideration because he had spent 40 years in a world that accommodated his reflexes without consequence. He thought about what his daughter had just described, a woman who, minutes before performing hours of surgical precision, had stopped to hold a frightened girl's hand and mean it. "She's not on shift right now," he said. It was not, technically, a lie. His daughter turned toward the window. Outside, Seoul's morning moved in its usual way, unhurried, enormous, indifferent to the smallness of what was happening in this room. "I want to thank her," she said quietly, "when she comes back." Royce looked at his daughter's profile and felt something arrive in his chest that he had no practice language for. Not guilt, he still didn't have full access to that. Something raw. The specific, unwelcome weight of understanding for the first time the precise size of what he had done. The statement had been his attorney's idea, the solo practitioner in Mapogu, the last one still returning his calls, and it had been presented to Royce not as a choice but as arithmetic. The footage was in the hands of his investors. His accounts remained restricted. 3 board members had requested an emergency governance review. The negligence filing, without legal representation willing to advance it, was functionally inert. The math, his attorney said carefully, only resolved one way. Royce had sat with it for a day. Then he had called the hospital's communications director and arranged the time. It was 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning when he stood on the steps of Seoul Metropolitan Hospital in a dark suit with no pocket square and no gold watch. He had left it in the penthouse, some dim instinct telling him that this was not the occasion for it, and faced the small cluster of journalists and camera operators that the hospital's press office had assembled. Not a crowd. Deliberately not a crowd. Royce had requested that, and the request had been granted, and he understood that the granting of it was itself a form of power. The decision about what this moment would look like belonging entirely to someone other than him. He had written the statement himself. That had also been his choice, and it cost him more than the writing of any document in his professional life. He read it without looking up. He said that on the afternoon in question, he had entered a medical ward in a state of distress that did not excuse and could not explain what followed. He said that Dr. Kendra Blake had performed, by every clinical and professional measure, an exceptional surgery under extraordinary pressure, and that the outcome, his daughter's life, was the direct result of her skill and her judgment. He said that his subsequent behavior toward her had been an act of cowardice disguised as authority, and that no amount of grief or fear entitled a person to use their money or their size to diminish someone who had just saved what mattered most to them. He said he had filed false negligence claims that he was formally withdrawing. He said he had put pressure on a hospital board to suspend a doctor whose only failing was being in the room when he needed someone to punish. He said he was sorry. The words sat in the morning air without embellishment. He did not reach for context or complexity. He had learned, from 48 hours of sitting with the image of his daughter's face asking for the kind doctor, that the one thing an apology cannot survive is explanation. When he finished, no one spoke immediately. The cameras continued their quiet work. Somewhere above him, the hospital moved in its usual rhythm, the sounds of a building that had continued functioning, without him, without his approval or his money or his gold watch, in service of the people brought through its doors. He folded the paper. A journalist asked if he had spoken to Dr. Blake directly. "Not yet," he said. "That's not mine to arrange." He walked back to his car through the gray morning light, and for the first time in 4 days no one was watching him from a corner of the room, and he found, strangely, that the absence of it was not a relief. He had the distinct and unfamiliar sense of a man who had just begun, only just, to understand what accountability actually weighs. She watched the press conference from her laptop, alone at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. She watched it once, all the way through, without pausing it. Then she closed the laptop and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and thought about what it felt like to hear the truth spoken out loud in public by the person who had most needed to speak it. She had expected it to feel like something large, vindication, or relief, or the particular exhale of a held breath finally released. What it actually felt like was quieter than that. A small, careful settling. The way a room feels when a window that has been rattling in its frame is finally latched shut. Hyunwood came home at 6. She heard the key in the door, and then the particular sounds of his return. Jacket on the chair, shoes set aside, the precise habits of a man who imposed order on every environment he moved through, not from anxiety, but from a deep, practiced preference for things being where they should be. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her when he was deciding something, which she had learned over time was different from the way he looked at everything else. Less assessment, more attention. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make fresh tea." He sat. She put the kettle on. They moved around each other in the small kitchen with the ease of people who have shared a space long enough that proximity no longer requires negotiation. When she set the cup in front of him, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, which was hanging on the chair behind him, and placed a document on the table. She looked at it without touching it. It was a deed of ownership. The letterhead was legal, formal, issued through a property-holding entity whose name she didn't recognize. The address on the document was the hospital's trauma wing, the ward she had worked in for 4 years, the floor where she had repaired the bowel, stopped the bleed, held the frightened girl's hand before the anesthetic took hold. Her name was printed in the designated owner field. She looked up at him.
You bought it, she said.
Not a question. She was reading the document now, properly, the way she read clinical notes, sequentially, without skipping ahead. 3 days ago, he said. The board needed liquidity. The trauma wing had been flagged for potential sale for 18 months. It wasn't difficult. She turned a page. Hyun. Her voice was level, but there was something moving underneath it. This is a medical facility.
It is, he said.
Yours. She set the document down. Outside the kitchen window, Seoul was beginning its evening, the sky shifting from gray to the particular deep blue that preceded the city's lights coming on, that brief interval where everything was suspended between two versions of itself. She thought about the boardroom, the 7 faces arranged around the oval table, the careful, cowardly language, the badge she had picked up herself because no one had the decency to ask for it directly. She thought about walking through the lobby doors into gray morning light with her shoulders straight because there had been no other option. She thought about what it meant to go back, not as an employee subject to the decisions of men who weighed her life against their liability, but as something else entirely. I'd need a full medical board, she said. Independent governance. Hiring authority. Yes, he said. And it runs on its own terms. No external interference. He looked at her over the rim of his cup with something that, on another face, might have been the beginning of a smile. That, he said, was the condition of the sale. She wore her own coat, not the one from that afternoon, that one she had folded and set aside, not thrown away, not because she needed it, but because discarding it would have felt like a concession to the idea that what happened in it had diminished her, and it hadn't. She wore a new one. Same cut, same white, same stethoscope looped at the neck with the particular ease of someone who has carried that weight so long it has ceased to feel like weight at all. Her ID badge was new too, different title, same name, the letters precise and unhurried the way she was precise and unhurried. She arrived at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, which was when she had always arrived. The lobby was already moving, the early shift cadence of a hospital morning, orderlies and nurses, and the soft percussion of wheels on linoleum, the smell of antiseptic and recycled air that she had, without ever deciding to, come to associate with purpose. She walked through it without announcement. She had not sent a memo. She had not asked for an assembly or a gathering or any of the staged ceremonial returns that institutions perform when they need to manage the story of their own failures. She had simply arranged, through the new administrative structure, to begin. The first person to see her was Minji. The scrub nurse was at the supply station at the end of the corridor, and she looked up with the reflexive attention of someone who registers footsteps by habit, and then she went very still. For a moment she didn't move. Then she straightened, not a bow exactly, more the full, deliberate uprightness of a person returning to their correct posture after a long time spent slightly reduced. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. Kendra gave her a single nod. Minji returned it. Word moves through a hospital the way it moves through any enclosed system, faster than the official channels, following its own invisible infrastructure of proximity and trust. By the time Kendra reached the corridor outside the trauma wing, the information had already traveled there ahead of her. She could feel it in the quality of the silence, not the frozen, complicit silence of that first afternoon, but something different. Attended. The silence of people who have had time to understand what their stillness cost, and who have no language adequate to the accounting. They were there. The charge nurse who had looked at her shoes. The resident who had taken a step backward toward the wall. The attendant who had been in the corridor and found somewhere else to be within 30 seconds of Royce's arrival. They were there, arranged in the unconscious geometry of people who know they are being witnessed and have decided, this time, not to look away from it. None of them spoke. Some of them bowed. Others simply held her gaze with the particular, undecorated honesty of people offering the only thing they had left to offer, acknowledgement, without excuse. She walked past them. Not quickly, not slowly. At her own pace, which had always been the pace of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had never required permission to go there. Her eyes forward. Her coat clean. Her hands steady, the same hands that had repaired the bowel, stopped the bleed, held the frightened girl's hand in the cold of an operating theater, and meant every word of the reassurance she'd given. Behind her, one step back and one step to the left, present without crowding, close without directing, Choi Hyunwood walked in his black suit with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in its customary stillness. Not leading, not performing, simply there, in the way that absolute and permanent things are simply there. She pushed open the door to the trauma wing. The work was waiting. She went in. And that is how it ends. Not with a scream. Not with a speech. With a woman in a white coat walking through a door that now has her name on the deed, and the most dangerous man in Seoul one step behind her. Not because she needs him to lead, but because he has never once tried to. If this story got to you, if you felt every single boardroom silence and every corridor that should have spoken up and didn't, let me know in the comments which chapter hit hardest. Was it when she walked out with her shoulders straight and her heart in pieces? Or when his daughter asked for the kind doctor?
Tell me.
Share this with someone who needs to see it. And if you're not subscribed yet, the next story is already coming, and I promise you, it starts with something you won't be able to scroll past.